Well, Greg, feel free to
All right,
kick
yeah,
us off if you
all right.
you want to here.
Let's get underway. I appreciate people
Sounds good.
logging on and joining us this evening. Tonight, we're continuing the town's efforts to figure out how best to respond to the challenges of climate change. We're already seeing evidence of storms that are flooding areas of town and present challenges that face us today, let alone 40, 50, 70 years from now. This is an effort that has been funded by a state grant from the Office of Coastal Zone Management. We're fortunate to receive funding from them to focus on the village core area and to look at its vulnerabilities and to come up with some, as I say, come up with some strategies to help us respond to some of the challenges that are coming our way or that are knocking at the door. Obviously, we don't know for sure exactly what those challenges will be in terms of, how much the seas will rise and how big the storms will be. So we can't pin it down on a precise date, but it certainly behooves us to develop strategies and to be able to implement those strategies if and when the time becomes necessary. So much of what we're looking at can be phased in over time and is an incremental approach as the impacts perhaps get bigger over the years. So tonight's goal is to review some of the preliminary recommendations that our consultants, Fuss and O'Neill, have developed. So they'll run through their recommendations and give some background why those recommendations are being made. And then really we would love to hear from all of you and to hear your thoughts on, what makes sense to you. Is this logical? Are there other ideas that we should be thinking about? Is there an recommendation that's being made that doesn't make sense to you? So we'd like to hear that as well. So it's really designed to gain some input as we develop the set of recommendations. And so after tonight, we'll be having the team develop a report of recommendations that'll be presented to the select board. That'll be at a meeting in June. And then from there, we decide which ones to pursue at what time. So with that brief introduction, I'd love to turn it over to the folks from Fuss and O'Neill, led by Alex Maxwell. Alex is the lead and has been presenting the various information to a steering committee that has been helping to guide this effort over the last few months. And so, Alex, why don't I turn it over to you and we'll get underway.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Greg. Appreciate the welcome here. Just get these slides up. Chelsea, you're one of the few squares I still see. Thumbs up. You can see this in the slide deck. Great. Yeah. Thank you. So hello and welcome everyone to this public meeting on the Manchester Coastal Vulnerability Action Plan. As Greg mentioned, my name is Alex Maxwell. I'm an environmental planner with the firm Fuss and O'Neill, based out of our Boston office. I just want to acknowledge I have a couple of other teammates on the call here with me tonight. I have Chelsea Zakis. Chelsea, you want to say a quick hello to folks?
Yeah, thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm Chelsea Zakis, environmental planner with Fuss and O'Neill. I'm really glad to be here.
Thanks, Chelsea. And I also have my colleague, Sarah Morrison, joining us. Sarah, you want to say a quick hello?
Hi, everyone. I'll echo the thank you for your time this evening. I'm a business line manager here at Fuss and O'Neill, focused on climate adaptation. And excited for you to see what we're thinking about tonight.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. And we also have Joe Family from Woods Hole Group that we're teamed with on this project, joining us by phone tonight. So he may chime in a little later as he's able, but certainly in by audio here. And can help address some of the questions that you may have on some of our prior work with the field investigations. Oh, thanks, Joe. Sorry. You want to say a quick hello?
No, thanks for the introduction. Glad to be here.
Thanks, Joe. Great. So that's our team here. So we'll be happy to answer any questions and certainly engage with you in conversations around the alternatives analysis, which will be the real focus of tonight's meeting. I did see before we hopped into the slideshow here, quite a number of familiar faces. So some folks from the steering committee that Greg mentioned, as well as many new names as well. So I'll kind of set us in context here, what this plan is about, where we're at in the planning process, and then what we're hoping to focus on here tonight. So as Greg mentioned, the plan is really being developed in recognition that Manchester currently experiences flooding in the downtown and Inner Harbor area that puts much of the critical infrastructure in this area at risk. And this is a situation that is only projected to become more problematic over time with changing climatic conditions. So this plan is really being developed to provide a community roadmap for reducing coastal flood risks and also increasing coastal resilience by developing a phased approach to establishing action-oriented mitigation measures, or those alternatives that we'll be speaking to tonight. This slide here gives a nice overview of our overall planning process. So what you see in the red circle there is where we're at just now in the alternatives analysis and in the overall planning process. As Greg mentioned, very shortly after this meeting here tonight, we'll be pulling this all together in a report or a recommended action plan that we'll then again present in June. And take on board all of the feedback that we've received to date and suggesting a phased approach to alternatives to mitigate against coastal flooding. But just to give you a little context on the steps that preceded the alternatives analysis, for those of you less familiar with the project, work on this project began back in November of last year. We started with a review of existing conditions, and this consisted of compiling mapping from existing sources, such as utility plans or past surveys, collecting quantitative data on past flood elevations in the project area, confirming resource areas within the Inner Harbor, and then importantly, collecting critical elevation information at low points throughout the study area, including drainage structures, first floor elevations, or other low points along the harbor. So that's what we were busy with during that very first stage of existing conditions analysis. And then we followed that by conducting an updated vulnerability assessment with a focus really on the Inner Harbor and the downtown area to assess both current and future flooding conditions and water surface elevations, along with an assessment of projected habitat change as a result of sea level rise. So some of you that have perhaps been following along with the project over the course of the past few months may have seen that vulnerability assessment, and included in that, we developed GIS inundation maps and figures for the 2030, 2050, and 2070 planning horizons. And along with that, an asset-specific assessment was conducted for buildings and infrastructure in the study area to look at what parts of the Inner Harbor and downtown were most vulnerable to coastal flooding over those different planning horizons. So this then really helped our team visualize and ultimately develop an initial list of prioritized adaptation actions over time, and really identified opportunities to address areas of concern with both site and neighborhood level flood protection strategies. So this will really be the focus of what we'll talk about tonight in the alternatives analysis, and we'll be welcoming feedback from you. So to dive right in on where we're at with the alternatives analysis. So as you could see from the figure I presented before, this is really the third phase of our project. And as part of this phase, our team, in consultation with the project steering committee that Greg mentioned, has identified several potential neighborhood scale and site scale alternatives to address key vulnerabilities for infrastructure at risk of coastal flooding. These alternatives have been developed to maximize the potential for both nature-based and hybrid design approaches to the extent possible. And also phased improvements have been proposed to really match several of the future climate risk scenarios in the short, medium, and long term, intended to follow the planning horizons that I mentioned before of 2030, 2050, and 2070 and beyond. For a little bit of added context, what we're talking about in terms of site scale alternatives, these are really focused on the scale of, say, an individual parcel or individual site, and they can range from the implementation of protective barriers to the relocation of critical building systems on that site, and infrastructure put in place to actually elevate structures as well. While on the sort of larger scale, or zooming out, to a neighborhood scale alternative, these can range from more nature-based approaches, such as the development of a living shoreline or a constructed wetland, to hybrid approaches such as a waterfront park, to even more engineered or hardened infrastructure that's already present, of course, in Manchester in the form of bulkheads and seawalls. So after completing the vulnerability assessment, our team, again, along with the project steering committee, really tried to focus in on several key vulnerable neighborhood scale areas and also sites. And so the neighborhood scale areas that we focused on included Masconomo Park in the Days Creek area, the Tappan Street and Beach Street neighborhood, Manchester Marine on the west side of the harbor, and then at the site scale, really focused on some of the more vulnerable infrastructure, including the wastewater treatment plant, the town hall, which of course includes the police station, and the Manchester Fire Department. So as a framework for the phased approach to planning neighborhood and site scale alternatives, we used the 2030, 2050, and 2070 planning horizons and the corresponding flood mapping that was developed during the vulnerability assessment to inform our near-term, medium-term, and long-term alternative scenarios, which we'll now lay out on the subsequent slides here. So we'll start with the near term and then work our way through the medium and long term. So starting with the near term, or the short term scenario, this would be what we really use some of the 2030 flood mapping to inform. We recognize that through the updated flood mapping and consultation with town staff and key stakeholders, several of the sites that I just mentioned throughout the downtown and inner harbor are already in need of flood protection. And I'll show you some of the photos of the items I'm talking about there. But these really include the lower elevations of Town Hall and the fire station, along with the wastewater treatment plant. So as part of this alternatives plan for the near term, we're proposing that the lower level entry points, such as the garage doors at the police station, down here along Town Hall, and the lower level fire station garage, and several of the entry points to the wastewater treatment plant structures be dry flood proofed as a near-term alternative solution. And that the critical infrastructure throughout the study area, which includes things like the generator located to the west side of Town Hall, and also the generator along the north side of the fire station, be elevated to protect it from flood risks. Additionally, what you'll see in this near-term plan, we've also suggested that a tide gate be added and the drainage be addressed for the catch basin, which is located just north of the east clarifier at the wastewater treatment plant. And then in thinking ahead, we're really suggesting that the town perhaps start exploring in the near term future possible locations for the recreational programming that currently exists at Masconomo Park, to allow for the games that may be played at this field to be played at other locations that are perhaps easier to maintain and certainly less prone to flooding. So that's just highlighting a few of the elements there. As I mentioned, this is a lot about protection. I mentioned dry flood proofing of structures. The images you see here on this slide on the left here, this is some of the sandbagging that's already happening around town. This is one of the low entry points to one of the structures of the wastewater treatment plant, along with the generator located to the west of the town hall building. When referring to areas that we would want to flood proof, these are certainly examples here of an area we would want to flood proof around the wastewater treatment plant. And then in terms of this generator, this is an example of a critical piece of infrastructure that we know is actually already being evaluated for possible relocation to elevate it out of the way of floodwaters here. But as part of that, that map that I showed you on the previous slide, I also mentioned things like the garage doors at the police station and the fire station there, just to give you a visual of what floodproofing could look like along those lines. We have a couple of images shown here in the slide of deployable flood protection measures that would provide the dry floodproofing needed to protect these critical entry points to those areas there. So that's a quick look at the near term alternatives plan. Moving now to the medium term and some of the thinking around alternatives that was informed by some of the 2050 flood scenarios. With the medium term scenario, the focus really shifted from more pressing dry flood proofing measures and elevating of critical infrastructure to more about where we might allow the water in, and also where we might be able to incorporate more neighborhood scale mitigation measures to reduce risk in several key areas. So as part of this alternative, we have recommended planning for the future relocation of the fire and police stations, as well as considering future buyouts and the restoration of areas along Sawmill Brook up in this area here. That's what you're seeing highlighted in orange. Additionally, in the medium term, the alternative for Masconomo Park is that it becomes more of a floodable park that acts as a barrier just south of the proposed road raising that we have for the low-lying road, which is Beach Street, to help reduce risk in this area and really buy more time for the commercial and residential areas bordering Beach Street and Tappan Street to reduce risk from flooding. This medium-term plan also incorporates an elevated berm, which you can see kind of snaking its way through the downtown area. We've proposed a walkway on that berm. And this is really intended to reduce the flooding in the downtown area, especially around the wastewater treatment plant, and provide the necessary elevation in this area here to actually tie into the elevation of Beach Street, which we're proposing as part of this alternative. You may note here in this part of the berm, we're also suggesting that this would require a deployable barrier be installed to still allow access through Beach Street during storm events, but be able to be deployed during storm events to provide an added level of protection in this area here. So that's a quick look at the medium term solutions. I'll give you kind of a couple of examples of what this actually looks like. This is an example of what an elevated berm could look like to provide neighborhood level protection. This is drawn from Norfolk, Virginia here, but you can see an elevated berm being installed along a waterfront, providing a buffer to nearby residential areas. This would be something similar to what we could see in Manchester by the Sea as proposed in our alternative. And then in terms of deployable flood barriers, here there are a few examples shown on the slide here. Flood barriers can be deployed as needed during storm events and then taken down from these areas. However, there are also alternatives that have been developed to deploy flood barriers that require much less in the way of operational control. They can be immediately deployed, perhaps even remotely, and then immediately recessed back into the pavement during non-storm events, placing less of a burden on sort of upkeep, maintenance, and ultimately the deployment of these protective structures. So that's just a little bit of a complementary visual to some of the alternatives expressed as part of the medium-term plan. And then really looking at 2070 and beyond in long-term planning, we've developed two different scenarios. You'll see the first of them on this slide, and then another one that follows. We considered one scenario where we would be able to coordinate with MBTA to actually raise the rail lines, which we certainly recognize as being a major hurdle and something that would need to be considered as a real long-term potential investment. But we looked at one scenario under which that would be possible, and then another scenario that doesn't consider any additional raising of the rails. So what you see here in this first plan alternative is the one that would incorporate the rail raising of the MBTA line as it runs through Manchester here. Under this long-term alternative, the raised rails would actually provide the necessary elevation needed to, again, still tie into the road raising on Beach Street. However, this alternative would actually allow for the consideration of a floodgate to be installed along the elevated portion spanning the opening in the inner harbor, which would provide a level of risk reduction for the entire inner harbor area here. The barrier put in place around the wastewater treatment plant from some of the past alternative examples there. So some of the previous efforts would still be, it would still be recommended that that be left in place to really provide some redundant risk reduction around that critical piece of infrastructure. But like the medium-term planned alternatives, this one still incorporates the fire station and police station being relocated to a different facility. And then in the area bordered by Tappan Street here and Beach Street, what we're proposing in the long term is looking at the possible elevation of the structures immediately proximate to Beach Street here, and then with the buildings along Tappan Street here, homeowners in this area could consider either also elevating their homes or possible buyouts that would allow for this area, which was previously filled, to potentially be restored and allow the water in. So that's a look at the alternative that we developed, considering a future possible scenario where the MBTA rail line would be raised through this area. But as I mentioned before, we also did look at, should that not be possible, what does the long-term planning perhaps really look like? And so in this long-term plan, we're really talking about accommodating more water, allowing more water to come into the area, and larger areas of the inner harbor having to be reprogrammed. So what you're seeing in this plan is a portion of the parking lot near Town Hall is made more floodable and softened to provide an additional buffer nearby the wastewater treatment plant site and the Town Hall site, while still allowing for a boat launch to remain in this area. In other areas, you're seeing is a sort of a buyout and retreat option for the areas bordering Tappan Street and Beach Street, really remaining as a viable alternative, in addition to shifting some of the possible location of office spaces and boat storage around the Manchester Marine neighborhood area here, moving some of the more office infrastructure back and away from more floodable areas, possibly shifting the boat storage to more floodable areas of the site to protect some of the infrastructure in that area. To give you a sense of what this can look like, there certainly is precedent for rail raisings. You can see here on the image in the upper right. This is some of the flooding that we witnessed during some of our site visits around Masconomo Park and Beach Street. But what we're really talking about proposing in that area is elevating that low-lying road and tying it into an elevated rail line, or possibly still tying it into the elevated berm presented in the medium-term alternative. if the MBTA rail line could be lifted and we were able to install a floodgate, it could look something like this, spanning the opening to the inner harbor. And then in terms of some of the elevation of structures along Beach Street, there's certainly plenty of precedent for this in areas that are flood prone. These are just some images of what that elevating could look like of residential and commercial structures there. And for the future possible scenario of Masconomo Park becoming more of a floodable park, this is a very realistic possibility. These are just a couple of examples of floodable parks here from Tallahassee, Florida, which still serve a purpose in allowing water in and allowing the park to serve as a buffer for floodwaters, but also still providing amenities in the form of access to the water in those areas. So that is a quick tour through our alternative plans there. I do want to now, with the time we have left, certainly open it up to questions, additional comments from folks. But before I do that, I'll just make sure anyone else from my team, if you have anything else you wanted to comment on, I know certainly going through those quickly there, but if you had anything you wanted me to flip back to that you could add on, I'm happy to flip back a slide or two if you have any additional comments there, Sarah or Chelsea.
I think we can just open it up for questions, Alex, and see
Great.
where the conversation goes. We can always flip back.
That sounds great. All right, so I'll open it up to questions and comments from folks here. And I see Jessica has kindly raised a hand here. Jessica, feel free to come off mute and give us your question or feedback here.
Got it. Thanks, Alex. I have actually a couple questions, comments. I served on the Coastal Resilience Advisory Group a few years ago too. So we had looked at some of this modeling and talked about different plans. And I think the challenge is you have the just sea level rise and the twice a day effect that's going to have at high tides, and then the separate but additional challenge of storm events. I know one of the things we talked about with the Coastal Resilience Advisory Group was an idea that seemed crazy, but it was sort of putting Greg, you can help me, I'm going to get the word wrong, but like inflatable dam thing that comes up like at the mouth of the harbor for storm events, which, is expensive and sounds, but when you're starting to talk about raising all the buildings downtown and trying to find a place to, I was on the high school building committee and I know how hard it trying to look at sites for that. So it's nice to say move police and fire, but the question is where. So I don't know if that's factored into your the conversations at all, the idea of a dam at the mouth, again, I don't know the right word, but the thing that kind of inflates from the seabed and rises up. And then I guess I was just also wondering in the discussion of moving the police and fire, does that mean also trying to find a new place for town hall as well, which I guess, again, that stuff gets into challenges of where it's all going to go. So I don't know, I guess that's kind of some questions, kind of some comments, and I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. So just to address the question around the floodgate at the mouth of the harbor or the outer harbor, we certainly did actually start by having conversations around that. And as part of this action plan, we're also doing the benefit cost analysis around all of our alternatives. And what we deemed as sort of not being feasible pretty early on was that idea of a floodgate further out in the harbor, just due to the cost of that investment, and really trying to focus on phased approaches to investments and alternatives that could be implemented over time, as opposed to that one sort of much larger investment in a protective measure like that. So that was certainly discussed, and in the course of our planning, we are factoring it into how we're considering all of the benefit cost analysis around all the proposed alternatives here. So that's a little bit on that. But in terms of moving police and fire, we don't, as part of this plan development, we aren't necessarily scoped to suggest where exactly that be moved. We just do know that it is vulnerable, and when it will be vulnerable. We were out there during some of the more recent storm events and saw the flooding that can come up. Saw in Sawmill Brook and along the parking lot on the backside of Town Hall. So what we're trying to do through this plan is really suggest what could be done as an interim protective measure at those locations, and then suggest that the conversations and the feasibility studies really start now for where they could potentially be relocated. But you also mentioned, sort of what happens to Town Hall. One of the things we're sensitive to is exactly what parts of structures are at potential risk. And we're really focused on the backside entry points to Town Hall. So it may be that those lower elevation entry points be allowed to be flooded in the future. However, at the higher elevation, at the street grade, Town Hall may still be able to function at the higher floors there and still serve its function within the community. So we're really trying to look at what aspects of the structures really need to be protected, and then maybe over the longer term be allowed to flood while still allowing perhaps other aspects of the structure to function in their current form. So hopefully that addressed some of your questions there. And Nate, I know you've got a hand up here too. I don't know if you have a comment or question, but feel free to chime in as well.
Yeah, I was just going to kind of elaborate on the PD and fire department relocation. So we're actually underway on a facilities master plan study where we're looking at kind of town-wide all of our facilities and incorporating the data and what we're learning from this study and how to plan for relocating those facilities and looking at what our alternatives will be, where else in town we could move them, and then kind of similarly with Town Hall. What can we do to, as Alex was saying, basically utilize Town Hall in the time that we have the basement available, and then in the future, how could it be, flood-proofed and utilized that we could, maintain operations in Town Hall as it is on the second floor from the front. So those things are underway and kind of working in conjunction with this study.
Thanks, Nate. Any other comments or questions or other feedback on the plans? I'm certainly happy to pull those images back up as well. Jeff and Mary, I see your hand up first, and then Chuck, I see you after that, so I'll get you in after. But Jeff and Mary, please feel free to chime in here.
A comment and a question. The comment is that I know finances will be an issue for everything. They always are. That's how life is. But being perhaps with the floodgate that we need to have across the harbor, across the entrance, sort of under the railroad bridge, is that roughly the place you're talking about?
Yeah, I can pull that right back on the screen here for you. Make that easier to reference for folks.
But just to be clear, that's different from the one at the mouth of the harbor.
Correct. Yeah. So
that one there, and where's the other one?
The only floodgate that we are considering as part of any future alternative scenario would be the one that could be installed should the MBTA raise the rail line through here. That would provide us with some additional elevation and the infrastructure investment needed to tack on a floodgate in this opening here.
So were there other locations where you were considering floodgates?
While our focus for this plan is really on the inner harbor and downtown area, we did pretty early days in preliminary discussions also look at a floodgate in the outer harbor and what that would mean. And it was deemed to not really be a feasible alternative in the future due to the sheer expense of that piece of infrastructure.
Okay.
So that was out past Tuck's Point. So
That's right. Yeah, it's a little off the map here.
Yeah. Now, my other question is in my self-interest. the people who are, this is great in terms of keeping the water out of the central areas, you know, in the areas you focused on. We live probably in the upper right corner of your legend area. We have the house that's right where Bennett Street and Bridge Street come together and make a little marsh.
Yeah, yep,
Bennett
right,
Brooks.
yeah, you're exactly
Bennett Brook
right.
Marsh.
Yep.
Yeah,
Exactly.
trying to,
Yep.
it's small on my screen, but hopefully I'm getting in there for you, Mary.
Yeah. So we're, you know, we built this house. We spent 7 years, we recently moved to California for 7 years. And when we came back, we could see that at a normal high tide, the amount of water that comes up is more than it did when we had left in 2013. So we can literally see this in our yard already. So hardening the downtown is great, but that's just going to push the water laterally, correct?
So yeah, it's an important point that you bring up about when you start to channelize water and harden certain infrastructure hydraulically, that can redirect it to other areas. So what we've proposed in our alternatives is really trying not to exacerbate flooding in other areas through the alternatives that we've proposed. So by allowing water into other areas, be it the floodable park in Masconomo or in some of the other areas where we'd be able to hydraulically connect the inner harbor up Sawmill Brook and softening a lot of these areas, it'll allow the water more areas to go and flood out. That would, you know, the intent really there is to hopefully not exacerbate any flooding in any of the surrounding areas. So that's something we're keenly aware of, and you know, through our approach to developing alternatives, while in certain areas hardened or engineered alternatives make a lot of sense, we're also looking for those areas that we can soften, maybe incorporate more nature-based approaches or hybrid approaches that give the water a place to go still.
Well, thank you. I'm very encouraged to hear that.
Thanks, Mary.
If
Appreciate
I
your
could ju-
comments there.
If I could just piggyback a
Sure.
little bit, I'm sorry to jump in.
No, go ahead, Greg.
So is there, I'm not familiar enough, is there a large culvert under the railroad tracks that feed back towards Bennett there? How does the water, yeah, right there. There must be some
this is-
connection, right?
This is,
Yep.
no, I don't know that yes, it goes through a culvert, but that's across Bridge Street, the property owned by Bob McDermott.
Right.
I think
Right.
that would be where it would be.
I was just
With
wondering how it gets
water.
by the railroad tracks.
Right, I
Yeah.
think the culvert would be on the far side of his land.
Yeah,
This water comes down from the Walker Road, the old Walker Estate and the hills up over my shoulder.
I just wonder if there's an option for a you know, basically one-way water gate on that culvert there to keep the seawater from.
Yeah,
rushing
Greg,
in.
this is
I
Joe
could- I could
Family
argue
with Silver.
with
We
Culver.
did start to look at that. I think that
Right.
there are a couple
Yeah.
crossings there that might be candidates for some sort of retrofit with a either tide gate or tide flap.
Yeah. yeah,
Okay.
And the other thing I'd say is, you know, the question about redirected flow is usually more of a question in a channelized environment like a river. So when you're talking about the water, the volume of water that you're blocking from some intervention in this inner harbor area versus the overall volume of water that is coming from the ocean, it's, you know, spreading that over the rest of the remaining area isn't usually going to unduly affect the surrounding areas.
Okay.
Something that would obviously be, you know, need to be looked at in more detail when you get further into design. But as a general rule, unless you're talking about like comparative volumes that are very large, not
Mhm.
something you usually have to worry about.
Okay, well, thanks for
Great.
the explanation. Now I know something new.
Thanks, Joe. And thanks again, Mary, for the comments there. I did see Chuck's hand go up, and Nate, I might have seen yours pop up there as well at one point, but let me get Chuck in here first, and then if you have something, I can circle back with you there.
Yeah, I guess I was just wondering, Alex, if you could kind of expand or elaborate on the alternative for the, working with MBTA to do something with the railroad tracks. It seems like that's tied into a critical elevation for kind of all of the long-term planning. And I'm wondering what that, if maybe you don't have the actual number, but maybe just in what our magnitude level of, what is that elevation that we're kind of looking for there, and what will it protect? And maybe you probably don't have it today, otherwise I assume you would have shown it, but something that would have, maybe compared the inundation maps of that, from the alternatives analysis or from the vulnerability assessment, and what we're kind of solving with these alternatives in the short term and longer term. And I think critical importance is the MBTA kind of working that out.
Yeah, no, Chuck, it's a good point you made there just at the end. I mean, obviously this all hinges on coordination with the MBTA, and really a longer term investment there in raising the rail and still providing that line out to Rockport. But what we are intending to incorporate into the plan is, as part of this alternative is, exactly what that elevation needs to be to tie into. I think in looking at the berm and the elevations through here, we're talking about potentially needing something in the 6 to 8 foot range just to provide the level of protection needed here to reduce the long-term future projected flooding at the sort of 2070 planning horizon that we showed in the alternatives analysis. But what's beneficial about the way in which Manchester is situated is without going too far, you can get into the elevations that you need to too far out of the study area. And that's what we'll be incorporating into the plan there to show, just at what point you can hit those elevations and can recommend to the MBTA just by how much we're asking that the rails be raised to provide that more neighborhood scale level of protection there. But to your question about the exact elevation, I'll have to get back to you with that as we finalize this plan, and we'll be writing it up into the alternatives table, which will provide more details, not just on the elevation for the berms and potential rail raisings, but also for the dry flood proofing measures by how much we need to have barriers put in place, how tall those have to be. Those things will be incorporated in the plan.
Yep. No, I appreciate it. I think, it's just something I wanted to make sure we expanded on.
Yep. Thanks, Chuck. All right. Nate, I know I said I'd come back to you, but I don't see your hand up. Are you okay for me to move on to a couple other folks who've kind of raised their hands here?
Yep, I'm good.
Great. All right. So I think I see here, just let me pull up the participants tab. I think Jessica, you may have had your hand up first, and then Laura, I can come back to you just after. But Jessica, feel free to come off mute.
Yep.
With any questions or feedback here.
I guess this kind of piggybacks on the MBTA questions. How, for the select board to analyze, I mean, there's not only the cost factor, but the interconnectedness of all of these things. I mean, like if you made Masconomo Park the floodable park and you raised the building, but if you didn't do the MBTA, you know what I mean? Like, so I don't know, is there going to be a chart that sort of shows what's interconnected? Like, okay, if you do this and do this, but haven't done that, then it's actually not going to give you the benefit, or the things that have to happen in a certain order. Does that make sense what I'm asking?
Yeah, no, Jessica, I follow there. So with the only plan where we've developed the kind of two alternative scenarios is in the long-term plan around the rail raising. And what we've presented on those two different scenarios, and then the other plans tied to the other planning horizons, a lot of those alternatives, they have to happen in conjunction in order to provide the neighborhood scale risk reduction that we're really hoping to address through those alternatives. So in our tabular summary of those alternatives, we'll make note of how, for example, it's not really worth elevating Beach Street just to elevate Beach Street if you're not tying it into the elevated berm that we've showed on some of the medium and longer term plans, alternative plans there, because you would still be allowing water back into the neighborhood around or bordered by Tappan Street and Beach Street. So a lot of what we've presented hinges on the alternatives hinge on one another, and those would be noted in the plan as to those ones that do other design elements that maybe don't necessarily hinge on each other. We've shown, and I'll pull this up on the screen here. In a couple of these, you may have noticed. Let me just pull back to the medium term here. Starting at the medium term, we also, this little yellow band around the inner harbor. We showed this in a few of the concepts here, but recognizing, if we were to look at Masconoma Park as more of a softened buffer, a floodable park, you're losing a key community amenity in this area. In a sense, you're allowing the water in. We would still, want to make it accessible and perhaps could include pathways through this area. But really, with the proposed softening of edges around the harbor, you're losing potentially some of those access points. And what we've proposed in the yellow here is just an idea for having a floating boardwalk that could still provide folks access to the water's edge, where they might be potentially losing it under certain circumstances or certain scenarios. And those, installing, for example, that even if you just did the eastern part of the boardwalk here along the eastern part of the harbor, that wouldn't necessarily hinge on having to have, the street elevated here at Beach and the berm installed. And those would be things that we'd note in the tabular summary that complements these visuals here.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the question there, Jessica. Sarah, did you have anything else to add in response to that? I want to make sure if we have any other folks on the team here that want to chime in.
Yeah, I did want to say one thing about the public access, and Alex is talking a little bit about how that might change over time with some of these proposed scenarios. And I like to think of it as the access to the water changing and evolving with the climate changing and evolving over time. And so rather than losing the access to the water, this would innately involve changing the way that Manchester by the Sea interfaces with water, and that will change over time no matter what. And so one of the things we did include was this boardwalk, which we didn't talk a lot about through the discussion, but that is really sort of a provocation here that we're including to sort of try to help all of you really begin to imagine how your interaction with the waterfront might change and evolve over time, while also looking at some of the risk reduction measures that we're implementing here as well. And so beginning to have that conversation with all of you about how do you want to interface with your waterfront moving forward. And I think, we are all ears and would love to hear thoughts about that as well while we're here tonight.
Thanks, Sarah. I know there are a couple other hands up here. Laura, I think your hand was up next, and then Jeff and Mary, I'll come back to you after Laura. But Laura, please feel free to chime in.
Hi, Alex. Thank you and the team. I have 3 points I want to, just comments I want to make as we're thinking about the future of the town's planning and our relationship to water. So the first is that all of these different land uses have different tolerances for flooding, and they need different levels of, sort of freeboard to the same flood. So if it's something as critical infrastructure, has a public safety impact, or is residential, that obviously has a much lower tolerance for flooding versus something like a parking lot or a park that might be able to get flooded, and with some of these natural methods actually act as a buffer and kind of soak up some of that flooding that otherwise might make the more critical infrastructure and residential more vulnerable. So I think that those two really go hand in hand about what is the use and how can we take advantage of that. The second one that I really see as an opportunity in this plan is just the fact that much of the land that we're looking at is municipal land. And so, that's sort of a double-edged sword, in that it has police and fire and water plants on it, but it's also a great opportunity as we think about, kind of long-term planning and what does our interface with the water want to be, that the municipal lands can really enable us to think about some bigger moves. And that part of the criteria as we think about what the strategies are for them should be not just, the sort of cost and the difficulty, the technical difficulty of doing these things, but what are the associated benefits that the town could get? So, more public access to the waterfront, like we talked about, perhaps more sports fields, addressing heat island with trees and some of the other, natural systems, improving water quality, which is an important issue in town. So again, some of those natural trees and soils and vegetation used to capture and filter stormwater, slow down the flooding. All those sort of associated benefits should be part of the evaluation of the strategies. And the last point I wanted to make is about the approaches. So these short-term, medium, and long-term, we need to think strategically about. It's not necessarily that we're just going to sort of step through. First we do short, then we do medium, then we do long. The short-term strategies have a much lower cost impact. They're kind of the low-hanging fruit. It's easier to do those, and it's like stuff that we should do probably pretty soon, right? But that the mid and longer term, both of those come with much heavier cost, capital level investments, and that the midterm, if we're talking about deployable barriers and so forth, also come with operational costs. So all those costs, not just the upfront capital costs, but all the operational costs need to be looked at. And then if you go through short-term, midterm, long-term, kind of stepwise like that, then you're essentially paying for the long-term benefit, the long-term strategy twice, because you're investing a lot in the midterm, and then you're undoing all that potentially to do the long-term. If you do deployable barriers around the police, say, versus moving the police. And it may be that we need to do the midterm in some of those cases, but we should look and think about the true cost of the long-term planning as a thing that probably necessitates, either short-term and then doing the long-term a little sooner, or the cost of doing the short-term, then the midterm and the long-term before we actually make those. And I think the MBTA track is one of the key things, because it is, it's a situation that's outside of our, town control, but it is also one of the most critical pieces that connects our town to the rest of the region. And while we can't control it, I think we also have more opportunity for state and federal funding and help to move the tracks, because the Boston metro area depends on it economically, and because we're talking about climate change that is due to, in large part, to emissions from transportation and from buildings. And so that's kind of how we got here. And so keeping an operational transit system is important to the overall solution of reducing emissions. So I went on a bit there, but thank you. I just wanted to give those points for sort of future consideration.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Really appreciate that. All right. Jeff and Mary, I think you had your hands up next, and then Steve, I'll get you in after that.
All right. Well, Laura, you had a great, the big picture and the medium scale picture. I have kind of what may be a silly question. A floodable park won't ocean water over a year or so kill off all the grass that's there? What kind of surface would you have on that would be inviting for, as inviting as grass, but survive in salt water?
It'd be a marsh.
Because otherwise you're just going to end up with the marsh plants kind of filling in, aren't you?
Sarah, do you
Alex, you
want
want me
to
to speak to that?
Yeah, I was going to say my LA friend, my landscape architecture friend is
Okay.
well versed in this. So Mary, I'll let Sarah.
Maybe this is a
jump
silly
in.
question.
No, no,
it's
not at all.
it's
Not at
absolutely
all.
not a silly
Yep.
question. And it's a question we hear often, and it comes back to the fundamental definition really of park space, and kind of that's one of those shifts that will be required really in many coastal towns and cities when looking at floodable parks. There's only so much saltwater inundation that a lawn can tolerate before it is not maintainable, before it will not function as a lawn. And so you're right, it would look different and the use would be different over time. If it's inundated, there would likely not be a ball field there, which is why in our short term recommendations, we're recommending early on looking at potentially, where some of those uses may go as well. So you would be looking at more of a sort of naturalistic, native planting along, a sort of organized, planned marsh, if you can picture that in your head. Thank you, Alex. Something that looks and feels more like this, that still provides space to be used. Perhaps there's elevated boardwalks through, perhaps there's still gathering spaces, but there's not going to be the sort of big, open, wide, flat lawn. Those types of spaces can be accommodated in other ways, and uses can be accommodated in other ways, but it would begin to look and feel quite different from the way that the park has looked and felt for quite some time.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
It does, and I think it's a question that, people may not even, the difference, what you said about a different definition of what a park is. And I think people who just look at the look at the maps are going to see, oh, okay, park, and that it's just going to be the same.
Right.
And it isn't.
Right.
And I think that's something that, people need to know. I don't know, maybe it's better if they don't realize it so we can get it done. I can just see something like that being a point that people might get very verbal and volatile.
Yeah, it's a really tricky thing.
Yeah.
It's a tricky thing for folks to grapple with, especially when there's so much history attached to our outdoor spaces and generational use.
Yes. We also have General Lafayette in the back corner there. Is he going to be relocated, or is he just going to be in the water? It'll take a while for it to get to him, I think.
Yeah.
So thank you for answering my question.
Yeah, thanks for the question there, Mary. And Steve, I think you've got your hand up next here. Feel free to come off mute.
Yes, thank you, Alex.
Thanks.
I just want to observe that we are currently experiencing storm surges that are 8 to 9 feet above mean sea level already, and could be somewhat higher in the future. And I think it is very important that we move quickly on the near-term recommendations, because those are things that are at risk right now. And so I hope we don't spend too much time talking about reorganizing everything just perfectly, and get the immediate issue of public safety and water treatment plants protected in the case of storm surges of the type that we are currently seeing, get that done very quickly. In that vein, I'm curious if you have done any comparative cost benefit analysis as to whether putting a flood barrier at the entrance of the inner harbor would be more effective than dealing with the cost of individually taking care of the other items that are listed in the near-term plan. Because it seemed to me that in principle, a flood barrier at the entrance to the inner harbor might take care of pretty much all of the immediate concerns around public safety and water treatment. Be curious on your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Yeah, so really good point about trying to focus on the near-term solutions. I think as Nate kindly chimed in with earlier, some of the things that we're proposing in terms of, relocation of certain departments, fire department, police department, that's already being looked at. And I think there have been certainly discussions around the need to flood proof some of the infrastructure around the wastewater treatment plant. And so it does seem like there's quite a bit of an appetite to make moves on what's needed now. The question about the having looked into the benefit costs around the Inner Harbor floodgate. One of the things that becomes the two things that become problematic about looking at that in the absence of the railroad elevation is that you actually need enough elevation to put in a floodgate that would provide the level of protection that would be needed for the entire harbor. So we, as part of the write-up in the plan, we'll show the benefit cost analysis on the floodgate there. But it's also something that, of course, politically we need to work with the MBTA on to actually get the rail raised first and then be able to install that floodgate, because in the absence of that, trying to do it now, even if you could get agreement in, with the MBTA, you actually wouldn't have enough protection to provide that level of risk reduction for the entire harbor without having the added elevation along the rail with what we were looking at in even the near term flooding there. So we will have the benefit cost analysis done for our alternative plan, so you'll be able to see that and dig into that. But what's really tricky about that floodgate in particular is it doesn't seem like it's a very viable option in the absence of being able to raise the rail.
Okay, I'll look forward to seeing details on that. It's not obvious to me why that is so hard without having to why you have to raise the rail to do that.
Yeah, in some of our flood mapping that you may have seen in the vulnerability assessment, elements of that rail line are already at risk of overtopping. And so it would kind of it would obviate the need for.
Yeah. Well, you know that from our prior conversations that I think that the state has directed you to use mean sea level projections that I think are outdated and misleading. And I don't think that those sea level projections that I think that that's your aversion to that may result from being forced to use those projections.
Yeah, so
I won't repeat everything that I said at the earlier meeting or that we said in our private discussion, or if anyone wants to, I'm glad to go into my reading of the literature on sea level rise, which is current and professional and I think accurate.
Well, Steve, certainly feel free to let folks know what we discussed in the past there and about your research as well, if folks are interested,
okay,
or you would like to.
Okay, I'm all right. Just as background, I did my work at MIT on energy and environment. Spent a fair degree of my career on that, and I'm currently an active alumnus with the Joint Program on Global Change, which is where MIT keeps its big modeling. I follow these data quite closely. When Alex presented the earlier projection, which we didn't see, the State Office of Coastal Zone Management directed them to use a projection which was of 12 inches per decade of increase in mean sea level. I inquired about that, and Alex very kindly, because that seemed very high, Alex gave me the documentation on that, which turned out to be from the IPCC, that's the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, AR5 report from 2014, where they used the highest emission level, and they used some work done at UMass Amherst about polar ice melting as a means of increasing sea level. Now, subsequent to that work, the IPCC commissioned a 2019 report on global ice melting or polar ice melting, and they folded that into their AR6 report, which was released in 2021. And based on that report, the projected mean sea level rise was 2 to 4 inches per decade. And parenthetically, the sea level has been rising in Boston at about 1 inch per decade for the last 100 years. I have checked with NOAA, and the most recent decade suggests that the rate of increase of the sea level rise has been 2 inches per decade. And I would be very, very surprised if for the period under which we are concerning ourselves that the mean sea level rise, not high tide plus storm surge, but the mean sea level rise would be more than 2 to 4 inches per decade as projected by the IPCC, rather than the 12 inches per decade that the state directed Alex and his colleagues to use. So this is not a gripe I have with Alex, it's a gripe I have with the Office of Coastal Zone Management for not using the most recent authoritative data in this matter. And I offer that as background, and if anyone wants to talk in more detail about which model to use or when or why or whatever, I'm glad to do that because I've spent most of my career doing that. But Alex's hands were tied in terms of using those projections, so I'm not arguing with Alex on that, but that's the background.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I appreciate you elaborating on that, letting folks know. So just to bring it back to our overall planning process, for those that did see the vulnerability assessment, the flood projections that we're using are based off of the Massachusetts coastal flood risk model that was based off of, as Steve mentioned there, work done in connection to the AR4 report and the UMass Amherst work there. And that's what the Commonwealth uses for climate planning.
Hey, Alex, could I just jump in?
Yeah,
1
please
second
feel
there?
free, Joe. And then Nate, I do see your hand up as well, so I can get you in.
Sorry, Nate. I just want to point out a couple things. Steve, you're not wrong. These projections do tend on the conservative side. I want to point out a couple things just to sort of put everything in perspective. You can use, so that the sea level rise projections that were developed by the state do go into the flood risk model. You can use both of those things flexibly, right? So if you think that the projection for 2030 is high or 2050 is high, then that might be the number that you see on the more 2050 or 2070 timescale respectively. And that is because the state used both the high scenario and the intermediate scenario for planning purposes. It's not all tied to a high emission scenario. It's a confidence interval, a high confidence interval around a range of scenarios and a range of contributions from ice sheet melt. So just wanted to put that out there as a clarifying point, and we certainly encourage communities to be flexible and adaptable in their approaches and monitor things over time. Thanks.
Thanks, Joe. And I just, the reason I'm flashing the short-term plan up here on the screen, I know that Dave kindly asked in the chat to just have a look at that, having joined a little late here. So I'm just going to leave that up on the screen here for a little while to allow Dave to have a look. But Nate, I know your hand's been up for a little while. Sorry to keep you waiting there, but feel free to chime in.
Yeah, no problem, Alex. Basically, I just wanted to, we're talking about the short-term solutions. And, this is the kind of first step in what we need to do with coastal zone management and the first look at doing our alternatives analysis for the area. And I was just hoping you could kind of elaborate for the group on, kind of the next steps of where we can take this and how we can apply for, grant money, hopefully, to address some of these short-term solutions.
Yeah, it's a good question, Nate. So yeah, part of what you need to have in place to start is a plan and is the benefit cost analysis done on a lot of these alternatives in order to then seek grant funding. CZM, or the Coastal Zone Management grants, are one mechanism of funding that can support the implementation of certain types of alternatives. And, things like the floodable park around Masconomo, the softening of some of those edges might be more appealing to a funding resource like CZM, whereas other funding mechanisms at the state level, like the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness, or MVP program, might better be able to support other types of alternative implementation, be it flood proofing or otherwise. Sarah, I don't know if you want to chime in on some of there's also federal sources of funding that hinge on the BCA analysis and some of the work that's been done here. But I don't know if you want to chime in on other mechanisms, NIFWIF or otherwise, that this work can unlock and enable to really address Nate's question there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's the problem these days is actually having the capacity to go after all of the funding that is coming out, right? And I think we're all seeing that at the professional level, and I'm sure many of us are in many of the fields that we work in. At the national level, the National Coastal Resilience Fund through NIFWIF is a great source for projects specifically like this. And then there's the sort of national competitions for the, BRIC grants as well, et cetera. All of them being more and more sort of fine-tuned and focused each round, and looking for projects of this scale. And the larger funding sources would be a great possibility for sort of pushing forward some of these big moves. Right. And then there are smaller funding sources that you could begin to look at for some of the short-term recommendations as well, to sort of take that incremental approach. And the way that we generally recommend moving things forward, and the reason we look at when we do the planning work, we start with the long-term visions and sort of back in to the midterm and to the short term, so that we begin with the end in mind, and build in the immediate, actionable, implementable movement that you can catalyze now, as at the same time as taking the next steps in the planning that will be required, the planning, the analysis, the design, which will be quite an effort to move some of these larger items forward. So, it's a balancing act of acting now, and getting that short-term money and balancing the continuing the momentum of this planning long-term. And there's an abundance of funding out there now. We're seeing new grant sources pop up monthly right now. So that are all aiming to provide mechanisms for the federal government to disperse some of these funds through the states. So there will be some concrete guidance on that included in the plan when we deliver it, with the final deliverable for this project.
Yeah, Nate, I mean, just to, speak personally, I look at a lot of the short-term alternatives and I immediately think, Masconomo is a good candidate for CZM. That, like I mentioned before, the flood proofing around the wastewater treatment plant, that's and like the police station and fire station, that's really good. MVP. There's maybe a couple other sources we could go after there, but this plan provides the evidence and the selling points that you need for those grant programs. And I think that's what's really nice here is a lot of the alternatives here we're really talking about are very fundable in the near term. And to Steve's point earlier, that's the stuff you should be going out and getting after now anyway. And you know, removing those sandbags and putting in some, you know, some real protective risk reduction infrastructure there will be great. And it's certainly fundable. So yeah, I appreciate you bringing up the point. Hopefully that addressed
Yeah,
it
that's
there.
exactly what I was hoping you could
Yeah,
share with
and-
the group.
Yeah, and Joe, I don't know if you have any, I don't know if Joe's, yeah, I see Joe now. Joe, I don't know if any of these other alternatives, you know, you have your wheels spinning around particular funding mechanisms, but if you had any additional thoughts there, feel free to chime in before I maybe pulled Dave back in here.
I think you hit most of the high points anyway, Alex.
Yeah, okay, great. Thanks, Joe. Dave, I know you've got your hand up and we're also active in the chat there. Feel free to come off mute and ask any questions or make any feedback you have here.
Sure, Alex. I don't know if your plan looked at some of the like really near-term issues, like if you want to open the chat there, I put in the near-term plan. There's things like, and I know Nate's aware of this, storm drains that are very close to our home and commercial buildings. And so are there any plans to put like a backflow valve to prevent, because when the harbor rate rises enough, water starts coming up through those drains?
Yeah, so Dave, let me just kindly put your image up on the screen here so I can just highlight a couple things. So I think this is what you,
Yeah,
are you seeing that now, or did that just go away?
it went away, but that's okay.
Okay, well, I'll just highlight it here on the short-term plan. So you might see this call out right here. It's tied back to the catch basin just north of the eastern clarifier. We have to look at the laterals in here, but we are aware of what you were talking about there in this area that it can back up. And so what we're suggesting in this area and in any of the connection points to this area, that a tide gate would probably be most appropriate for preventing that from backing up and really addressing the overall drainage in this area, so that we don't have, like in the case of what we saw out in the wastewater treatment plant, which is proximate, I think, to the area you were highlighting just here.
Yeah.
You know, a rubber mat being deployed to try and plug the black flow. That is probably better served by a tide gate that would prevent that.
I think can you just explain a tide gate quickly, how that mechanism?
Yeah. I don't have I wish I had a photo, but essentially it can be like Joe mentioned, even like a tide flap, but it can be a structure put in place that basically lifts up and blocks tide waters from coming back in through a drainage system, and then, you know, as water levels recede, can be allowed to flop back down again and allow for flow and drainage out of the drainage system.
Yeah, I think you guys are kind of talking about the same thing anyway.
Yep. So how-
Backflow preventer can be
Yeah.
installed further up gradient, or a tide or a flap or a duckbill could be
Like
installed
Tide
in-
flex, yeah.
So Joe and Alex, how quickly can something like that be put in place? Because I mean, we're one storm away from, you know, getting water. It came pretty close in January, so I'm saying within 12 inches. So the January storm, had it been 12 inches higher,
Mm.
you know, we would have had water in our garage. So just wondering how quickly something like that could be put in place.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a near-term alternative. Nate, I don't know if you have any history of installing, you know, similar infrastructure around town, but it's, you know, stuff that can be done on the order of like within a year, kind of.
Yeah, we
installation.
haven't,
Yeah.
you know, in the time I've been in town, but it is something that we've looked at, and that area certainly is, you know, so that area where you are, Dave, for the water treatment plant, for the town hall parking lot, you know, those are all areas we've looked at. Tappan as well is another area that has that flooding issue that we've looked at doing the tide flexes. So it, you know, that's certainly something I think we need to move closer to the top of our list for these areas.
Thanks, Nate. Yeah, great.
Thanks, Dave. We've got a few minutes left before we hit the top of the hour and bring things to a close here. I do have a couple of slides on next steps, which will provide information on how to continue to provide feedback and input to the planning process, where you can find more information on the project. But before I get to that, does anybody else have any other questions or additional feedback or comments on the alternatives presented here this evening? Dave, I see your hand up. I'm wondering if that is from the last time or if you have an additional comment or question there.
Yeah, it's just left over. Am I
Oh,
supposed to
okay.
I gotta lower my hand. Sorry, guys.
Perfect. Oh, no worries. No worries. All right. I am not seeing any other hands. Let me just quickly check the chat here. Okay, I don't see anything else there. So I will get us over to our review of next step slide here. So just looking ahead, and Greg sort of mentioned where we're heading next in the process here in his welcoming remarks here. But to let you know, now taking on board the feedback that you've kindly provided with the alternatives analysis, we're going to wrap that up into our draft recommended action plan, which will include some of the other elements that we mentioned, a tabular summary of the alternatives, the complementary BCA on many of the alternatives. That's a benefit cost analysis. And we'll be presenting that in June, and would certainly welcome all of you back for that presentation, and would welcome feedback as well on that draft recommended plan, and then taking on board the feedback from that presentation of the draft recommended plan. We would then finalize that for submittal to the Office of Coastal Zone Management at the end of June. And from there, it's really looking towards the implementation of what could be done next. And I think we highlighted here today some of those near-term actions that can be taken, and already kicking around ideas for some of the funding mechanisms. So we will be putting out notification about that final public meeting in early June to review the draft plan. For those of you that don't know yet, we also have a project website that I'll give my colleague Chelsea props for maintaining and putting together, and certainly thanks to all the folks from the town side as well, especially Sue, who's been kindly helping coordinate with Chelsea to make sure that the project website is populated with the latest information. There's a QR code that you can use if you have your phone handy and want to point it right at that'll take you right to our website. There's a short URL here, and it's also located on the town's website under its list of projects as the Coastal Vulnerability Action Plan project as well, if you're looking to find it that way. If you do navigate to the project website, there's also an email sign-up form under the engagement tab. If you want to receive, the email notifications about project updates, upcoming meetings, that's a great way to stay informed as well, beyond the normal broadcasts that we do through the town channels there. But with that, I'll just put up as well another way you can reach out with feedback or continue to stay engaged. My email address is here at amaxwell@fando.com. I certainly welcome you to contact me at any point with any additional questions or comments or feedback. If you're like me, you might be walking the dog later this evening and think of that question or that piece of feedback that you wish you had gotten in there. This certainly doesn't have to be the only opportunity to provide questions or comments. Please feel free to reach out to us. And I just want to thank everyone again for the time here this evening. It was really great to get all the questions and all the helpful feedback here, especially on a really nice warm day here in May, when I'm sure you were probably looking outside with the sun setting and wishing you'd gotten a little more of that sun in. But we really appreciate the time here together online to connect about this project. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Alex.
Great.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Thank you
Alex
all.
and the team.
That's great.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Have a
you.
great night.
Thanks, everyone.
Night, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks.